women in the workforce. We needed workers, and the men were fighting the war. And so we turned to the ladies. This, of course, incredibly famous poster of Rosie the Riveter was part of the American government's program to try to get women to go out and work producing the things we needed to fight the war. And, of course, it was very successful. Women who previously might have been considered too old or too married to work, remember, there still was very much the idea that if the husband could support her, the woman shouldn't work. Will enter the workforce, and many times not even for the money, but just to help the war. The idea that you could go and work in a factory making bullets or airplanes or something that might save your brother or your husband or your son was of course, a big motivation to women. Jobs tended to be segregated by gender and race, and so there were jobs that were men's jobs, jobs that were women's jobs, jobs that black women did, and stuff like that. Women joined unions. And it began to erode the prejudice against working moms. I'll talk more about that in a minute. But there had been this idea that you should stay home and raise your kids if you have children. But of course, desperate times call for desperate measures. And women went into the workplace even if they had young children at home. And here you see this monument in Washington, D.C. to the women that worked. This is, I think, a great American story that comes out of this period. If you don't recognize this woman, let me tell you her story. She's 15 years old, I believe, when she goes to support her family. Her father had run off, and her family was fairly poor, and so she gets one of these jobs in these factories. And a life photographer comes around to take a picture, just do a story on women in the workforce. And he decides that she's incredibly beautiful, and he takes a series of pictures of her. His editor is not interested in these pictures, but years after the war, somebody comes across these pictures and decides she's very pretty and tracks her down, and she becomes an actress. They decide there's too many brunettes in Hollywood, and so they dye her hair blonde. Her name was Norma Jean Mailer, but they decide that's not sexy enough, and they change her name to Marilyn Monroe. And this is really a kind of a great American story of the day. This little girl goes to work in a factory, gets discovered, and becomes probably the most recognizable woman in the world in the late 1950s and early 1960s. But she's also in many ways a symbol of the materialism and kind of the shallowness of post-war America. She is, of course, legendary for her great beauty, and at least on screen playing women of little substance. She's kind of the prototypical ditzy blonde. I'm not making any comment about her off screen, but that was definitely the caricature of her that she portrayed on screen. Of course, she also tragically becomes an exemplar of the tragedies of the 1960s when she overdoses on sleeping pills and dies in 1963. But Marilyn Monroe, in many ways, is an appropriate icon, representing so many of the great forces and kind of underlying currents of her time. But anyway, she is discovered by a live photographer working in one of these factories. Most women who worked for the government. Women could join the WACs and the WAVES. These were auxiliary corps who served in support of the men. Mostly this meant they did clerical work. Why have an able-bodied young man typing up reports or something when you could have a woman do that and the man could go out there in the field and fight? And so women, and you see, they get uniforms, they get rank, they get paid actually pretty well if you translate those into modern dollars. But women played a major role in these support capacities. Unfortunately, though, there was no real child care industry. And of course, these women frequently had kids. And we began to see the development of the latchkey kid, or the 8-hour orphan they were called at the time. And these are kids who may go to school all day, come home, let themselves into an empty house, have to make themselves dinner because their moms are off. Their dad's off, of course, fighting the war. He's in the Pacific or Europe somewhere. And their mom is off maybe working for the military or working in a factory trying to support the war. Oftentimes, moms would go to their jobs and just leave the kids in the parking lot. And I know this sounds crazy to our minds today, but if you went to a World War II factory here in America, the factory might be full of working moms, and the parking lot might have dozens and dozens of kids just running around unsupervised all day long. We begin to develop the sense of juvenile delinquents, not coincidentally during the time, and juvenile crime begins to go way up. But kids were often working too. About a third of Americans 14 to 18 years old were in the workforce themselves. Another thing that happens is the prosperity leads to more and earlier marriage. A great many guys decided to marry their sweetheart before they went off to war, in case something happened, and also to try to ensure that maybe that relationship would last beyond the war and she wouldn't stray, or perhaps he wouldn't stray. Of course, this separation led to a lot of widows, war widows, as the men went off to fight in the war, and a great many of them died. But it also led to separation. If you can imagine two people getting married at the age of 18 and then really not seeing each other for the next 3 years, that would be a very difficult relationship to maintain, and that was certainly true. And after the war, these early marriages will lead to the baby boom, as a lot of these men who go off and fight in this war want nothing more than to come home to the security and comfort of kind of the traditional classic American family that we're going to develop in the late 40s and 1950s.